The sound it makes is not loud. That is the first thing you notice. You expected something dramatic, iron screaming against iron, a boom that rattles your teeth. But the door simply closes with a dull and final thud, the way a book is shut by someone who has already stopped caring about the story inside. And then there is only the dark, not the soft dark of a bedroom, not the familiar dark of a closed eye. This is a different thing entirely. This is the dark that has been here for decades, pooled in the corners, settled into the cracks of the stone like old water. It has texture, it has weight, and it is, in a way that you cannot yet articulate, alive. You stand very still. This is instinct, not courage. The floor beneath you is stone, not smooth, but uneven, worn down in the center by years of feet that paced the same narrow path between wall and wall. The ceiling, if you reach up, is closer than you expected. The room, if you can call it a room, is perhaps 8 feet by 5, perhaps less. The measurement matters more now than it ever has before. Go ahead and adjust where you are. Settle in, pull whatever warmth you have a little closer, because this part of the story is going to require your full stillness. There is a smell, but we will come to that. First, there is the sound of the world outside the door disappearing. You hear footsteps receding down a corridor, stone floor, leather sole, a pace that is neither hurried nor kind. Then a door farther away opens and closes. Then nothing. The nothing is not peaceful. The nothing is a presence. Medieval prisons were not designed to punish through violence alone. That would have been too expensive, too effortful. They were designed to punish through this, through the particular cruelty of sensory removal, through the slow, grinding weight of having nothing to look at, nothing to listen to, nothing to mark the movement of time. You did not choose to be here. Almost no one did. Medieval incarceration was rarely a formal sentence in the way we understand sentencing today. You might be here because someone with power wished it. You might be here awaiting a trial that may or may not come. You might be here because a debt went unpaid, or because you were standing too close to the wrong person at the wrong moment in a city that had no patience for the unlucky. The charge, if there was one, does not feel real anymore. What feels real is the stone against your shoulder as you lower yourself to sit. What feels real is the cold already working its way through your clothing, already settling into your joints like an uninvited guest who intends to stay. What feels real is the sound of your own breathing, slow and careful and very, very alone. Somewhere above you through stone too thick to measure, the evening is continuing without you. You run your hand along the wall, slowly, because there is nothing else to do, and because the body, in the absence of tasks, invents them. The stone is cold in the way that only very old stone can be, not merely the cold of temperature, but the cold of time, as though the centuries themselves have settled into it and refuse to be warmed. It is rough beneath your palm, irregular. There are places where the surface is smoother, worn down not by tools but by contact, by the hands of every person who sat where you are sitting now, who reached out in the dark exactly as you are reaching, perhaps for the same reason, perhaps only to feel something solid, perhaps only to remember that the world is still made of matter. You find something with your cell, fingertips, a groove, narrow, deliberate, running horizontally for perhaps 3 inches before it stops, then another, crossing it, then a series of small vertical lines, 4 together, and 1 diagonal across them. You have found what you were not looking for, a record. Someone sat in this cell and counted, not the hours. There was no way to count hours in a room with no window, no candle, no bell, close enough to hear. They counted days, or what they believed were days. They counted the meals, perhaps, or the guards' visits, or simply the moments when they woke from sleep and decided that the waking meant something new had begun. Take one slow breath. Feel for just a moment how incomprehensibly far away that person is. They are not a name in any record you will ever find. They were not a king, or a general, or a saint whose story made it into the chronicles. They were someone ordinary, a tradesman perhaps, or a farmer who came to the city at the wrong time, or a young man whose name was similar enough to another's to cause a terrible confusion. They sat in this cell. They pressed a stone or a nail or their own fingernail into this wall. They made these marks, and then At some point, the marks stopped, whether because they were released, or because they were moved, or because the counting no longer mattered. You will never know. This is what the stone remembers, not the dramatic moments, not the dramatic moments, not the dramatic moments, not the confessions or the trials or the sentences. It remembers the quiet persistence of ordinary people trying to hold on to time with their bare hands. The walls of medieval prisons were not blank. They were written on, scratched into, prayed into. Archaeologists have found crosses and prayers and names and crude drawings of animals and ships and figures that might be family members or might be saints, or might simply be the shapes a hand makes when the mind is trying to stay octu. Upside every mark was a conversation between a human being and their own fear. Every mark said, I was here, I existed, I was not nothing. You press your own hand flat against the stone. It is the most connected you have felt since the door closed, and you do not know quite what to do with that. You notice it in layers, the way you notice a piece of music, one instrument at a time, until suddenly you hear all of it at once and cannot unhear any of it. The first layer is damp, not rain damp, not the clean wet of a storm, but something older and more permanent, the damp of stone that has never fully dried, of moisture that has been seeping through the same cracks for so long it has become part of the architecture. It coats the back of your throat, it sits in your lungs like something borrowed, and beneath it, almost immediately, comes the second layer, rot, not sharp or violent, but soft and chronic, the smell of organic matter in slow, patient surrender. Straw, perhaps, old straw, laid on the floor weeks ago and never changed, compressing slowly under weight and moisture into something that has forgotten it was ever a living thing. Then comes the third layer, and this one you breathe through carefully, the smell of the people who were here before you. Not their bodies exactly, not yet, but what the body leaves behind when it has been confined too long with too little water and too little dignity. The cell does not smell of death. It smells of life lived at its most reduced, which is, in its own way, harder to sit with, because death is an absence, and what this smell describes is a presence, the stubborn, unglamorous presence of human beings surviving in conditions that were designed to make survival feel impossible. Medieval prisoners were rarely given access to sanitation of any meaningful kind. There may be a corner designated, by unspoken agreement, for the neck. Ascetes of the body, there may be a bucket emptied at intervals that feel arbitrary and punishing. There may be nothing at all, only the floor and the understanding that shame is a luxury you can no longer afford. Dignity, in here, is redefined entirely. It becomes not the absence of humiliation but the refusal to stop being a person despite it. The small, daily insistence on remaining human in a space that has no interest in your humanity. You breathe through your mouth, then your nose, then you stop trying to manage it and simply breathe. This is one of the first lessons the cell teaches. You cannot negotiate with the things you cannot change. Resistance costs energy you do not have to spare. Acceptance is not defeat. Acceptance is survival strategy. There is something else, though, underneath all of it. Something so faint you almost miss it in the effort of processing everything louder. Something almost like wood smoke or tallow candle, or a kitchen that was once nearby. Something that smells, improbably, like warmth. Like a world that still has warmth in it. You cannot tell if it is real or remembered. In here, the line between those two things begins to soften almost immediately, and no one tells you how long it takes before it disappears entirely. But beneath everything, underneath the rot and the cold and the damp, there is something almost human, and that, somehow, is the worst part of all. His name is Thomas. Or perhaps it is Willem or Henry, or something in a language that no longer exists in quite the form it was spoken then. But give him a name, because he deserves one, because the guard who walked these corridors every night was not an abstraction, not a symbol of oppression, not a figure in a morality play. He was a man with cold feet and a wife at home and a candle that burned too fast in the draught that came up from the river. He was a man doi, in a job that paid poorly and smelled worse, in a building where the cheerfulness went to die. His name is Thomas, let us say Thomas. Thomas begins his rounds at what the monastery bell, if you can hear it from here, would call compline, the last prayer of the canonical day, rung as the monks file into the dark of the chapel, and the city outside begins, gradually, to quiet. He has a lantern. The light it throws against the corridor walls is orange and unsteady, and it precedes him around corners the way a small announcement precedes bad news. You hear it before you see it, the scrape of the lantern against stone, the soft rhythm of his boots, the almost inaudible sound of his breathing. He is not trying to be quiet. He is simply a man who has walked this path so many times that his body has learned to do it with minimal effort, like a river that has worn its own groove. He stops outside your door. You hear him stop. There is a pause. Not long, but particular, the pause of a man who is neither curious nor indifferent, but something more complicated than either. He may look through the small grate, if there is one. He may simply stand and listen, checking by sound rather than sight, the way an experienced shepherd learns to hear a flock rather than count it. Then he moves on. His footsteps diminish. The orange edge of lantern light withdraws from the gap beneath the door, and you are in the dark again, but it is a different dark now. It is a dark that has been witnessed. Thomas does not hate you. This is important, and it is also somehow lonely. Hatred would be a relationship. Hatred would mean you existed in his inner life as something more than a door to be checked and moved past. But Thomas is tired, and his feet hurt, and he is thinking about the bread his wife left by the fire, and whether the youngest child's cough has worsened, and whether there is any chance his shift ends before the cold deepens further. You are a task, you are completed, and then continued past. There is a man on the other side of the door right now who knows you exist and has no particular feelings about it. You will listen for his footsteps after this. Every time, you will learn the exact timing of his rounds without meaning to, the way you learn a neighbour's habits through a shared wall. And on the nights when he comes slightly late, a part of you, a small, irrational part, will wait with something almost like worry. His footsteps fade, then return, then fade again, and after a while you realize you have been listening so hard your jaw aches. You are not alone. This may be a comfort or it may not be, depending on the particular texture of your loneliness, and loneliness in a medieval prison cell has many textures. Solitary confinement existed, but it was expensive. It required a cell to be given to one person, which was a luxury most prison administrators did not consider worth the cost. More often, cells were shared, sometimes 2 people, sometimes 6, sometimes more than that. In the worst and most crowded facilities, where the bodies of the living were stacked against the bodies of the almost living and everyone breathed the same used air and tried to arrange themselves so that the sharpest bones of a stranger's elbow were not driving directly into their ribs. Tonight there are perhaps 3 others in the room with you. This is, by medieval standards, a moderate arrangement. There is an old man near the far wall who has been here so long he has stopped being surprised by anything. He sleeps on his side, his back to the room, his knees drawn up in a posture that looks like self-containment, probably is. He has a name that no one uses anymore. Before this, he was a wool merchant whose business partner accused him of something that may or may not have been true. He thinks about his daughter sometimes, the one who married well and who sent word, once, through a guard who could be trusted. He does not think about much else. His breathing is slow and even, and in the dark you can almost mistake it for comfort. There is a younger man, young enough that his beard has not decided what it wants to be yet, who arrived 2 days before you and has not stopped shaking. Not from cold, or not only from cold. The shaking is something else, something the body does, when the mind refuses to accept a new reality and keeps trying to reject it, like a fever burning off an infection. He will stop shaking eventually. You do not know if that is a good sign or a terrible one, and there is a woman which surprises you and should not. because women were imprisoned too, in the same cells as men or in separate wings depending on the institution and the decade and the whims of whoever was in charge that particular year. She has already arranged a small space for herself against the wall, with the focused efficiency of someone who learned long ago that small dignities require deliberate construction. She has folded her outer garment into a pillow. She is asleep, or appears to be, and her face in the dark is simply a face, neither hard nor soft, simply human and resting. You listen to them breathe, all free. You match your own breathing to theirs without meaning to, the way the body synchronizes with what surrounds it. Someone in the far corner begins to hum very softly, and only for a moment, and no one says a word about it, and no one will. The deepest hours of a medieval night were called, in the canonical tradition, vigils, the watch, the keeping, the long and sacred duration, between the last prayer of the evening and the first prayer of the dawn. Monks rose for it. They rose into the cold dark and sang into the dark, and tea. Hen returned to sleep. It was an acknowledgement that the night was not only for rest, that something in the human spirit needed to witness the darkest hours rather than simply sleep through them. In the monastery this was holy. In the cell it is only real. You have lost track of time completely. This happens faster than you expected. Without a window there is no shift of light to follow. Without a candle there is no wick to measure. Without a bell close enough to hear, there is nothing to divide the night into portions. There is only the dark, and the dark is featureless, and you are inside it the way a stone is inside the way. A stone is inside the earth, not moving, not counting, simply present in a continuous and undivided now that the mind does not know how to process. You try to reconstruct the day. What you ate, what you said, the last face you saw before the door closed. The face is already blurring. This frightens you more than the cold does. Memory, you are learning, requires maintenance. It requires the small daily reinforcements of conversation and light and the ordinary sensory reminders of who you are and where you come from. Without those, it does not vanish immediately. It softens. The edges go first, then the middle, and what you are left with is not quite forgetting, but something more unsettling, a version of remembering that you can no longer fully trust. The others are asleep, or they seem to be. The old wool merchant's breathing has deepened into something that sounds almost peaceful. The young man has stopped shaking. The woman has not moved. You are, in the functional sense, awake and alone even in company, which is one of the more particular loneliness that confinement manufactures. You think about counting. You have seen the marks on the wall. You think about starting your own, but there is nothing to scratch with, and nothing yet to count. You have been here only one night. The marks begin when one night becomes several, and several becomes a week, and a week becomes a question. You cannot answer about how much longer you can remain yourself in a room that is trying, quietly, to unmake you. The trick, you are beginning to understand, is not to resist the dark, but to inhabit it, to stop waiting for something to happen, and to be simply here. It is not surrender. It is the opposite of surrender. It is the most active thing you can do in a room that permits no other action, and somewhere in that formless dark, without deciding to, you stop waiting and simply exist, which is perhaps the oldest survival skill there is. The bread, when it came, was not good bread. Let us be precise about this, because the food of confinement deserves precision. It was not the dramatic, maggot-art riddled nightmare of popular imagination, but it was not far from that either, and the distance between the two was not always comforting. It was dark bread, dense and slightly sour, baked from whatever grain was cheapest and most available, which changed by season and by the fortunes of whatever city or estate surrounded the prison walls. It was heavy in the hand. It filled the stomach without ever quite satisfying it, the way a conversation can fill a silence without ever addressing what the silence was actually about. There might be a soup on luckier days, something thin and warm, brought in a clay bowl that was never properly cleaned, smelling of the same few vegetables that could be bought in bulk and boiled repeatedly without anyone noticing the difference. Pottage, it was often called, a word that contains within it everything that word implies. Sustenance stripped of pleasure, nourishment divorced from joy. You ate it with your hands if there was no spoon, which there often was not, and the warmth of it against your palms was almost worth the indigenity of the eating. Medieval prison rations were not standardized in any meaningful way. They varied by institution, by the status of the prisoner, by whether someone on the outside had the means and the will to pay for improvements. Wealthier prisoners, and yes, wealth operated even in here, as it operates everywhere, bending the rules of suffering to its own convenience, could sometimes receive food brought from outside, a pie from a tavern, a piece of cheese wrapped in cloth, real bread, on very rare occasions wine. These were not luxuries so much as reminders that the world outside still contained such things, that the people who sent them still thought of you, that you were not yet forgotten entirely. Most people received no such reminders, and so they ate what they were given, and in the hours after eating, when the body was occupied and the mind was briefly quieted, by the simple animal satisfaction of having consumed, they dreamed. Not only in sleep, in waking too. Medieval people were not embarrassed by the interior life the way that later centuries sometimes would be. Prayer was a form of directed dreaming. Memory, deliberately walked through, was another. A man who could no longer access his life could still, with concentration and practice, visit it, could walk the streets of his own town in his mind, could enter his own house, could smell the fire and hear the voices and feel the familiar grain of a table he had built himself. Some of them became very good at this. Some of them lived more richly in imagination than they ever had in freedom, because confinement teaches you brutally and without sentimentality exactly which things matter. The dreaming at least costs nothing, and some of them, it is said, became very, very good at it. His name was probably something short. The names of people who did quiet good in forgotten places tend to be short. If history knew even then, it would not bother to preserve them fully. Call him Edmund. Edmund was a guard, not Thomas, not the regular one who did his rounds with the lantern and the tired boots, but a second guard, the one who worked the lesser hours, the one assigned to the distribution of food and the emptying of the bucket and the small administrative tasks that the more senior men had long ago decided were beneath their continued attention. Edmund was not a kind man in any dramatic or deliberate sense. He did not arrive at the prison each morning with a philosophy of compassion. He arrived with cold hands and a slightly runny nose and the same mild dissatisfaction with the world that most people carry quietly through most of their lives. He was not cruel. In an institution where cruelty was freely available and largely unpunished, he had simply, consistently, chosen not to participate in it. This is not nothing. In certain contexts, this is everything. What he did was small. It is almost embarrassing how small it was, given that we are recording it across centuries. When he brought the bread, he sometimes brought it slightly warmer than he needed to. He had learned which corner of the kitchen held the heat longest, and he timed his collection deliberately, not hurrying back the way the other guards who wanted only to be done with the task and away from the smell. When the soup was thin, he sometimes used the ladle more generously than his instructions required. When a prisoner was coughing badly, he occasionally brought a second ration of water without being asked and without explaining why. He never spoke much. That was not his way. He did not offer comfort in words, because words in that context felt to him like a kind of lie, an implication that things were better than they were, which he could not, in good conscience, suggest. But he could make the bread warm. He could make the ladle generous. He could make the second trip with the water feel like an ordinary thing rather than a favor, which preserved for the person receiving it something of their dignity. No chronicle mentions his name. No record was kept of what he did. The institution did not notice and would not have cared. But in one cell, in one winter, in one forgotten decade of one medieval century, there was a woman, the same woman who had folded her coat into a pillow, who slept with her face composed and her dignity intact, who received a piece of bread that was still faintly warm, and who held it in both hands for a moment before eating it, and who felt, briefly, like a person to whom someone had been kind. She remembered it. She carried it with her when she left. And kindness, even in the dark, has a way of being passed forward. Not everyone left. This is the sentence history. Would rather leave unspoken, would prefer to soften into something statistical and therefore distant, but it refuses to be softened. Not everyone who entered a medieval prison cell emerged from it alive. Some died of the cold, which in the deepest winter months could reduce a weakened body to something that simply stopped quietly, without drama, without the theatrical last moments of cautionary tales. Just a gradual stillness, a slowing, a final breath indistinguishable from all the others until the next one did not come. Some died of illness. The prison was a perfect environment for the cultivation of disease. Confined, damp, poorly ventilated, crowded with bodies under stress, whose immune systems were already doing more than they could sustain. Dysentery moved through the cells the way rumours move through a village, quickly, invisibly, leaving ruin behind it. Tuberculosis was patient. Tuberculosis could afford to wait. Wounds, untreated, became infections and infect. Irons became fevers, and fevers in a place with no physician and no medicine and no family member to sit beside you through the night became the last thing that happened to you. Some died of despair. This is the hardest one to write down because it demands a precision that the language of the era did not always provide. They did not call it what we call it now. They called it, sometimes, a failure of the will, a surrender. They noted it in records the way they noted the weather, factually without judgment as a thing that simply occurred. He gave up the ghost, a phrase so old it has forgotten what it meant. She passed quietly. He was found in the morning. These are the entries that take up least space in the ledgers, because a life that ended without resolution, without trial, without sentence, without the satisfying narrative closure of judgment rendered, was a life that the administrative machinery of the time had no real category for. The cell was cleaned, or cleaned enough, and then it was given to someone new, and the new person arrived. As you arrived, as everyone arrived, disoriented and cold, and not yet understanding the specific grammar of this place, and they sat against the same wall and ran their hands along the same stone, and perhaps found, without knowing what it meant, the marks another person had scratched during their own long counting. What they did not find was a name. The names were rarely left. There was a superstition about it, perhaps, a sense that leaving your name on a prison wall was a kind of concession, an admission that you expected to stay, and most of them, even in the deepest nights, kept some small and irrational flame of belief that they would not be here forever. The ones who did not come out kept that flame the longest, and the cell, when it was emptied and given to someone new, was simply a room again until the door closed. The first sign is not light. It is sound. Somewhere above you, through stone, through floor, through the accumulated weight of a building that has been holding its breath all night, you hear footsteps that are different from Thomas's footsteps, more than one set, moving with purpose. The particular tempo of people arriving somewhere to do something rather than people performing the endless loop of routine, and then, distantly, a door, and then another, and then, closer, the sound of a bolt being drawn back, and you realize your body has gone rigid without your awareness, tensed around a hope you had not fully admitted to having. The door opens. The light is not dramatic. It is grey and thin, the light of a winter morning working its way through a narrow corridor, and it is the most beautiful thing you have seen in your entire life. This is not metaphor. This is physiology. The eyes that have been deprived of light for a full night or more responding to its return with something that is indistinguishable in the body from relief. You squint. Your eyes water. You raise one hand to shield yourself from something that by any objective standard is barely bright at all. A voice tells you something. You hear it, but you do not process it immediately because your attention is entirely occupied by the light and by the smell, which is different from last night's smell. There is cold air coming from somewhere, real cold air, moving air, the kind that carries in it the distant memory of the world outside. You are being told that you are released, that there was a mistake, or that a payment was made, or that someone spoke on your behalf, or that the man who put you here has reconsidered, or one of a dozen other explanations that were available to medieval justice and that add up, in this moment, to the same single fact. You can leave. You stand. Your legs are stiff, and your legs are stiff, and your back aches in a way that feels ancient, as if it has been aching for years rather than hours. The old wool merchant watches you from his corner. His face does not change. He has seen people leave before. The young man is awake and watching with an expression that is trying very hard not to be longing. The woman has already turned her face back to the wall. You walk out. The corridor is longer than you imagined, the staircase steeper, and then the outer door, and then the cold morning air against your face, like a hand placed gently on a fever. You stand in it. You simply stand. Around you, the city is doing what cities do in the early morning. Bakers carrying baskets, a cart moving over cobblestones, a dog investigating something near a wall, two women talking at a corner with the easy fluency of people who slept in their own beds and woke in their own morning. No one looks at you. The world did not stop while you were inside. The world did not even notice. You take one long, slow breath of cold morning air and you hold it. Everything around you is exactly as you left it, and nothing, not the light, not the cold, not the sound of ordinary life continuing in its ordinary way, is quite the same.